So today we're going to talk about a period of time that I call the Great Revolt. And this was a series of revolts against colonial rule in the late 1600s that drastically reshaped colonial societies across North America. And today we're going to be looking at three different revolts. First, that of King Philip's War, which was a revolt by the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Wabanaki tribal nations against the Plymouth colony, Massachusetts Bay, and and the colony of Rhode Island. Then we're going to look at Bacon's Rebellion, which was a revolt, a colonial revolt, actually, by Nathaniel Bacon, who was a planter in Virginia. And as well as a group of other men, revolted against the royal governor at the time, William Berkeley. And then lastly, we're going to look at a revolt by the Pueblo peoples of modern day New Mexico against Spanish colonial rule, and specifically against Spanish missionaries, which drastically shaped how the Spanish sought to govern areas in modern day New Mexico and actually secured indigenous autonomy for Pueblo peoples well into the modern era. So with that, let us begin. Now, the goals of the class for today are first to understand the reasons for Native revolts against colonial rule, and then be able to explain the impacts of the Great Revolt on colonial societies, because colonial societies changed substantially due to these major revolts, both on the East Coast and also in modern day New Mexico. Now, the first of the great revolts we're going to take a look at today is that of King Philip's War, which occurred in the 1670s in modern day New England. And this was a war that began for a variety of different reasons, but mostly stemmed from the expansion of English villages and English settlers into Wampanoag lands in modern day southwestern Massachusetts. And the English were able to take territory not only through sort of military expansion, but also through these contested land claims, which you talked about in the previous lecture, where unscrupulous sort of individuals who had ties to the English claimed that they own Wampanoag villages and then sell this land to the English illegally, disregarding the sort of traditional political structures of Wampanoag society. And so, two individuals in particular were behind the sort of revolt against English expansion into Wampanoag lands. That of Metacom, who also went by the name of King Philip, who was a sachem or leader of Paconet, which is located around here on the map. And then that of Weetamoo, who was a woman's leader of the area known as Pocasset, which was a Wampanoag territory located around here. Excuse my poor drawings. But both of these individuals sought to organize Wampanoag society to resist English expansion, both in English courts and then eventually in sort of armed rebellion. And in fact, it is sort of tensions from these English expansion that leads to this war breaking out. When a group of Wampanoag men kill a Wampanoag individual who had a lot of ties to English settlers was essentially selling out Wampanoag villages in Paconet and illegally selling Wampanoag territory to the English. And Metacom says no more of these sort of illegal treaties and illegal land sales on sort of pain of death. And so this leads to a large-scale mobilization of Plymouth Colony, which was located here on the coast. I'll put that right here. So Plymouth Colony, a lot of the English were in modern-day Plymouth, and then Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston was located up here. And so the English in Plymouth Colony and Massachusetts Bay mobilized armies. The Plymouth Army in particular moves very aggressively against Wampanoag villages and starts attacking recalcitrant Wampanoag villages in Paconet that were under King Philip's or Metacom's rule. And the Wampanoag launched a large sort of counterattack against this English army, and they began attacking English towns that were in the western part of modern-day Massachusetts, around here, and especially in the south, towns that were sort of in between Wampanoag territories. And so they attacked Deerfield, Swansea, Brookfield, and other English towns, and killed a lot of English civilians, and actually burned down many of these towns. And then the Plymouth Army with Massachusetts Bay also goes into Wampanoag villages, burns them down, kills lots of different civilians, and you begin to have lots of Wampanoag refugees going not only into swamps and bogs in modern-day Massachusetts, but also fleeing to Narragansett villages. And so Wampanoag forces reorganize in these swamps away from their home villages, and they seek to try to lead English armies into these swamps where they can ambush these English armies, and many of these sort of ambush attacks actually are quite successful against English forces. But Wampanoag civilians flee to Narragansett villages located down around here in modern-day Rhode Island. And these Narragansett villages accept these Wampanoag refugees. And this leads to tensions in modern-day Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island is a colony led by Roger Williams, who was a dissenter of many Puritan sort of practices. And Roger Williams wants to adopt a more sort of conciliatory relationship with Native Americans. And he actually is seeking not to get involved in this conflict. And so, unlike Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth Colony, Rhode Island does not actually mobilize an army to fight against the Wampanoags. And in fact, is trying to stay out of this conflict. But the combined forces of Massachusetts and English armies come into the territory of Rhode Island and attack Wampanoag villages in northern Rhode Island. And the Narragansetts, meanwhile, start taking in a lot of the Wampanoag refugees, which raises suspicions of the Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, that the Narragansetts are actually participating in these attacks on English towns. The Narragansetts themselves actually declare declare neutrality in the conflict in late 1675, and state, we don't want to be involved in this war. But the Plymouth Colony does not believe that the Narragansetts are actually staying out of it, and end up marching a large army into Narragansett territory in modern-day southwestern Rhode Island, and attack a major Narragansett settlement, and actually kill hundreds of Narragansett civilians in what is today called the Great Swamp Massacre. And this leads to the Narragansetts adopting a full war footing against their former allies. Because remember, the Narragansetts joined with Massachusetts Bay in attacking the Pequots just a few decades before. So these were their traditional allies. But facing this sort of unprovoked attack by the English, the Narragansetts raised their own army and attack English settlements, including the settlements of Rhode Island, which also had previously declared neutrality. And so they actually attacked Providence, Rhode Island, and burned down a lot of that town, and attacked many other English settlements in modern day Eastern Rhode Island. And so this leads to a larger war widespread conflict that really takes over all of New England as many Native American nations join in a sort of general revolt against the English settlements and English colonies, regardless of their diplomatic views. And so eventually the English are able to force out Metacom's Wampanoag forces to New York, and Metacom tries to reform his army in modern day New York. But the Mohawk people of the Five Nations, of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois, end up actually allying with the English and attacking their common enemies, because the Haudenosaunee had routinely sort of attacked Algonquin peoples in around New England and into even the Great Lakes region. So the Mohawks actually lead a surprise attack on Metacom's forces, force Metacom to retreat back to New England, where his force is found and caught by an English army, and Metacom is hunted down in a swamp and killed. And the Wampanoags and Narragansetts negotiate a surrender with the English, ending this conflict, at least in southern New England. However, many Wampanoags and Narragansetts, refusing to surrender, actually relocate north and move to Wabanaki country in northern Maine, where they joined forces with the Wabanaki on a sort of northern front against English settlements. And so, while the war in the South is a major defeat for Native Americans, the war in the North continues and actually is quite successful. So as the Wampanoags and the Narragansetts come and resettle in Wabanaki country in the north, they are actually able to continue to raid New England towns in northern Massachusetts, and areas in modern day Maine. Now, the Wabanaki call their homeland Wabanakik, or Dawnland, the area that's the first to see the sun as it arises in the morning. And it's a confederation of a variety of different peoples, including the Micmac, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Wolastoq. And the Wabanaki actually are very successful in obtaining resources during the winter. And so these are lands that are incredibly snowy, incredibly cold, and the Wabanaki invent a number of different technologies that allow them to gather resources in the winter, like moose and frostfish and ground nuts. And specifically, they use snowshoes. And through snowshoes, they're able to walk through these deep snows in northern Maine, and actually gather significant resources. And so it's this group of people who continue their war against the English, with the help of these Narragansett and Wampanoag refugees, and they're actually very successful. So the English had established a number of different settlements around modern-day Maine, and all these settlements are completely destroyed. The colonization of Wabanaki territory in modern-day Maine is massively set back by King Philip's War. and English settlement is significantly pushed back. And so the Wabanaki, along with their newly arrived Algonquin allies, are actually able to preserve their autonomy for most of the later part of the 1600s and into the early 1700s. And it's worth noting as well, these Wabanaki raids against English towns are part of what actually causes the Salem witch trials, as young girls in Salem are freaked out by the survivors of these raids coming into town, bloodied and injured by Wabanaki raids into northern Massachusetts. And it's the fear of Wabanaki attack that leads to a sort of air of paranoia in Salem, and actually arguably leads to some of the Salem witch trials. And so it's through the Wabanaki technology of snowshoes that they're actually able to engage in a lot of this mobile raiding against the English. Um, and they're also able to engage in a fur trade with the French, and gain significant wealth and material resources from the fur trade. And so this leads to the English being vulnerable to Wabanaki attack um, for decades into the 1700s. But the English learn from these setbacks. And so, even though many different English villages are wiped out by the Wabanaki in the late 1600s and early 1700s, they realize that snowshoes are actually very important as a sort of military tool. Because while the Wabanaki are able to raid English settlements during the winter, in the winter, the English in these like deep New England snows can't really move. They're not as mobile, and so they can't counterattack against Wabanaki raids. And so the English actually get a hold of Wabanaki snowshoes, and they learn to make them, and they start mass producing them for their own armies. And it's through the adoption of snowshoes by English soldiers that they're able to begin to protect their settlements from these Wabanaki raids in the winter, and then eventually strike back against the Wabanakis in the early 1700s. And as well, the sort of waning of the Little Ice Age in the 1700s means less deeper snows. And that also helps the English be able to more successfully strike back against the Wabanaki. And so eventually, the English, through a series of wars, are able to push back against Wabanaki attacks and begin to resettle parts of Wabanaki territory and expand their settlements into modern day Maine. And so it's through the adoption of indigenous technology and the learning of of these sort of hard military lessons that the English are able to sort of reestablish themselves in New England as a very powerful force by the early 1700s. So the next rebellion we're going to look at is that of Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in the 1670s. So Bacon's Rebellion stemmed from a variety of different issues, one of which was that of Virginia's social structure, which over the course of the 1600s got increasingly hierarchical as planters with larger land holdings actually monopolize land in eastern Virginia and along that of the James River. And this means that people in the middle classes who are seeking to gain wealth and gain more land to grow their wealth aren't able to do so as there starts to be a land scarcity among the possible land that's available along the James River and in eastern Virginia. And so what you have is a number of settlers who begin to move west into native land, and they're seeking more land to grow their holdings. And it's worth mentioning, this isn't the type of farming where they get a hold of some land, grow some wheat to feed their family, or maybe send a little bit to market for a little bit of profit. This is again plantation agriculture that uses enslaved labor to grow wealth, and these people are mostly growing tobacco and other cash crops. And so you have this group of almost like discontented middle class people who want to become the rich and powerful planters in Virginia society, but they're cut out because they cannot get access to enough land. And so they want to have a more expansionistic policy against Native American nations so that they can get a hold of this land and become richer. And you start to begin to see tensions between Native American nations in the West and these more aggressive Virginia settlers. And tensions arrives specifically with a group of people called the Dogue. And the Dogue attack a Virginia settler, kill two people on his property, as well as burn down a bunch of his crops. And this leads to a group of Virginians in the west of Virginia to seek retaliation against the Dogue. But the people, these Western Virginians aren't as discriminatory in terms of understanding different Native American nations. And so they end up actually attacking a cabin that was built by the Susquehannock people, who had an agreement and a partial alliance with Virginia. And they end up killing 14 Susquehannocks, who then mobilize a huge force to raid the western edge of Virginia. The subsequent Susquehannock raid ends up killing around 60 Virginians. Now, the governor at the time was a person by the name of William Berkeley. And Berkeley believes more in sort of adopting a defensive posture against native nations and wants kind of order and control over the frontier. He doesn't want these sort of random raids happening back and forth between native nations and Virginians on the frontier. So he adopts a defensive posture, and instead of retaliating against the Susquehannocks, which he thinks is going to start a larger war, he negotiates with the Susquehannocks, builds a number of forts in Western Virginia, and says, okay, well, we're just going to defend our land in Western Virginia, and we don't need to start a whole huge conflict over this. Well, the response of these Virginia frontiersmen is to be incredibly angry at Berkeley's policy, because Berkeley's policy is not only sort of preventing them from getting revenge against this latest Susquehannock raid, but it's also preventing them getting access to more native land that they want to use to become rich planters, just like the elite in Eastern Virginia. And so, due to this anger at Berkeley for his de-escalation, which is actually quite a successful policy, a person by the name of Nathaniel Bacon, who's a prominent Virginia planter in Western Virginia, organizes an army of around 400 men, and he takes this army and he starts roaming about the frontier and attacking basically any Native American villages that they find. And so he finds a village of Occaneechi people, who are actually enemies of the Susquehannocks and would be great allies for the Virginians. gets in an argument with one of their chiefs and kills hundreds of Okinachi people. He also drives the Pamunkis, another group of Native Americans who were allied with Virginia, and he drives them into hiding and leads them to flee their villages from this um, very sort of violent, roving group of Virginian men who were basically just kind of running rampant on the western frontier. And so William Berkeley looks at this army. He's like, this is disastrous. This is going to lead to a huge war. It's going to lead to massive expense. And so Governor Berkeley declares Bacon and his group as outlaws and declares their attacks illegal. And sort of seeks to bring this rogue faction to heel. And in response, Nathaniel Bacon and his army actually turns against Berkeley and engages in almost an uprising against William Berkeley. And so he arrives, he marches east, and with this army arrives in Jamestown, the capital of Virginia at the time, and Bacon's men burn Jamestown to the ground. And this army continues to basically has an open revolt against the Virginia Commonwealth. Now, eventually, despite the incredible violence of this army, it peters out quite quickly. While camping in eastern Virginia, dysentery actually sweeps through the army, and Nathaniel Bacon actually dies of dysentery. And without their leader, and with a English army being formed to respond against Nathaniel Bacon's forces, the rebellion really just peters out and falls apart. While Bacon's rebellion itself is not successful in its aims, the consequences of it are actually almost more important, because it freaks out the Virginia planter elite in Eastern Virginia. And it especially freaks them out because Bacon's army not only draws upon these sort of discontented middle class white people who are seeking to become rich planters, but actually also draws a little bit of interracial cooperation and draws some black Virginians into his army as well. And elite Virginians are really worried about this. And so it actually leads to a calcification of slavery in Virginia as stricter rules and regulations are put into place to make slavery a more oppressive system, and to really make sure that there won't be a rebellion among enslaved black Virginians against the white planter class. The other thing that Bacon's rebellion leads to is a more expansionistic policy against Native Americans, as again this Virginia planter elite looks west and says, if these people don't have land, they're going to revolt against us. And so it leads to a turn away from sort of Berkeley's defensive alliance system that distinguishes between a variety of different Native American nations, and seeks to engage in Native American politics to secure Virginia. And so this will lead to many more sort of frontier groups being indiscriminate against different Native American nations, not recognizing who's an ally and who's an enemy, and engaging in sort of mass racist slaughter against Native American peoples. And so the consequences of Bacon's rebellion almost sort of accomplish the goals of the rebellion itself, even if the rebellion itself kind of peters out. For the last revolt we're going to look at in this period of the Great Revolt, we will discuss the Pueblo Revolt, which occurred in New Mexico in 1680. Now, the Pueblo people lived and still live today in organized villages in modern-day northern New Mexico. Now, despite their proximity to each other, many of these villages actually spoke completely different languages from one another. However, they had very similar life ways. They practiced agriculture, again, growing three sisters, maize, beans, and squash. It also had adobe homes that were generally like right next to each other in these close-knit communities. And the Pueblo peoples had their own complicated set of religious beliefs, including sacred structures, which they called kivas, and the belief in kachinas, or spirits. Now, the Spanish colonized this region in the late 1500s, actually quite brutally. And with Spanish colonization, Franciscan missionaries set up mission villages and towns in Pueblo communities. And the Franciscans were quite strict with their religious practice and actually outlawed Puebloan religious practices and persecuted Puebloan religious figures. And the Spanish in general were quite brutal towards the Pueblo people, quite notoriously. A Spanish conquistador named Añate actually punished a rebellious village, a rebellious pueblo called the Acoma Pueblo, by ordering the cutting off of feet of every single male person over the age of 12 for simply resisting Spanish rule. Now, a number of factors led to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. In the 1670s, the Spanish actually began a crackdown on Puebloan religious figures. They arrested 47 Pueblo medicine men and executed 4 of them. And in addition, this was a time of famine and attacks by the Apache against Pueblo villages, and the Spanish did not really protect the Pueblo villages that successfully. And so these variety of different factors actually led to a plot to overturn Spanish rule. Popey, a medicine man from Tao Pueblo, ended up leading the plot. And you can see here, actually, this is a statue of Popey, and this is the statue that New Mexico sent their official representation of the state sent to Congress in Statutory Hall, and so every state gets the sort of privilege to send a artistic statue or a representation of an important historical figure of their state in Statutory Hall, and Popey was the one that New Mexico recently had commissioned and sent to Congress. And so Popey organizes other Pueblo leaders to rise in a synchronous revolt against the Spanish. And this actually required a lot of coordination because, again, all these villages spoke different languages. And so how do you coordinate this across a variety of different cultures and languages? Well, Popey actually came up with an idea to distribute long ropes or cords with knots in them. And he distributed these cords to each Pueblo villages with messengers. And each day, a knot was to be untied. And once all of the knots in the cord were untied, that would signal for the revolt to commence. And so this plan actually worked quite successfully. And while the Spanish gathered some intelligence about the plot, they weren't able to stop it. And so on August 10th, 1680, most of the Pueblo villages actually rose in revolt in unison against the Spanish and expelled the Spanish from their towns. And so these revolts end up killing a lot of Spanish settlers, and these revolts specifically target Franciscans and Spanish priests for specifically to attack because of the degree of oppressiveness that the Franciscans perpetrated against Pueblo religious leaders. And so the Spanish and the Franciscans were expelled from all the Pueblo villages and fled to Santa Fe, where they were besieged by the armies of the Pueblo people. And eventually, the Spanish are able to escape, but they effectively abandoned New Mexico. And the Spanish were pushed out of Pueblo territory for a decade. And eventually, the Spanish were able to recolonize New Mexico, but they would never again implement this religious oppression over Pueblo villages. And the Pueblos were able to secure their religious autonomy until the modern day. And Pueblo nations today continue to practice their traditional beliefs. And so this will conclude this lecture. But this period of the Great Revolt was very important for determining how colonial powers would react towards Native American nations into the 1700s. And it really does reshape relations in modern-day New England, in the modern-day American South, and in the West, in New Mexico. And out of all these revolts, arguably the Pueblo Revolt was probably the most successful because it actually does secure religious autonomy for the Pueblo peoples. Whereas King Philip's Rebellion in New England and Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia lead to the English adopting more expansionistic policies against Native American nations, and less the sorts of policies where they might ally with one Native American nation to then attack another, but more a general aggressive stance against all Native Americans on their borders. It also leads to Native American nations beginning to cooperate more with each other in trying to expel European colonists. And there's a number of larger scale revolts and cooperations between Native American nations in the 1700s that we'll talk about in Unit 3. And so with that, I will leave it there. And for the next lecture, we will take a look at the growth of English colonies and the demographic changes that were happening in these colonies, both in the modern-day American South, as well as the middle colonies, which we haven't talked about as much, in New England. Because the 1700s sort of inaugurates a massive period of immigration to English colonies and an period of expansion, both demographically and territorially, for these colonies. It also inaugurates the calcification of slavery on the East Coast of America, and the increasing number of slave societies in America, where slavery pervades all aspects of society. So we will talk about that in our last lecture of Unit 2. So I will look forward to seeing you then.